80 meters of open ground separated Trooper Mark Donaldson from a wounded man who couldn't move. PKM rounds were chewing the dirt in overlapping arcs from two ridgelines, kicking up geysers of gravel every half second. An RPG had already punched through the lead vehicle in the convoy, scattering metal and men across the wadi floor. The interpreter, a young Afghan working under the call sign Nidash, had been thrown clear by the blast and now lay face down in the open, exposed to crossfire from two directions. Donaldson, positioned further back in the column behind a long-range patrol vehicle that offered no armor and barely any cover, could see Nidash wasn't moving. The ambush had been waiting for them. 80 to 150 Taliban fighters had set an L-shaped kill zone in a narrow valley roughly 25 kilometers from forward operating base Lok, in the Badlands of Uruzgan province. DSHK heavy machine guns sat on the high ground. PKM medium machine guns covered both flanks, RPG teams occupied the compounds below, and mortar tubes were dug in on the reverse slopes. The patrol, 8 men from the Special Air Service Regiment, and roughly 12 Afghan National Army commandos, plus interpreters, spread across 6 open-topped Land Rovers, had driven straight into the mouth of it. The fire was accurate from the first burst. The lead LRPV took a direct RPG hit within seconds of the ambush opening, and the blast wounded most of the crew. A DSHK on the western ridgeline began hammering the convoy at a rate that made movement between vehicles impossible. PKM fire from the eastern ridge completed the crossfire and turned the valley floor into a killing ground. Every vehicle in the column was taking hits, and the patrol's only advantage was that the Land Rovers carried heavy weapons of their own: MAG-58 machine guns, an Mk-19 automatic grenade launcher, individual M4 carbines, and a sniper team already scanning the ridgeline for the DSHK position. Donaldson tried to reach Nidash 3 times. Each time he broke cover and sprinted toward the open ground, the volume of fire drove him flat. PKM rounds tracked his movement, stitching the dirt ahead of him, and he had to crawl back behind the nearest vehicle. 80 meters is a short distance under normal conditions. Under aimed machine gun fire from 2 elevated positions, with no cover between the start point and the casualty, 80 meters is the longest run a man can make. The interpreter lay motionless the entire time, and there was no way to know from that distance whether he was alive or already gone. The 4th attempt was coming. Donaldson had a fragment of RPG shrapnel already lodged in his back from the opening minutes of the ambush, and the fire from the ridgelines hadn't slackened. But the interpreter was still out there, and Donaldson had already decided he wasn't leaving him. By the 2nd of September 2008, the Special Operations Task Group had been running disruption patrols through Uruzgan province for over a year. Rotation 9 of the SOTG operated from Forward Operating Base Lok and FOB Russell, and their principal job was strangling Taliban supply corridors that ran through the valleys south and west of Tarin Kowt. The regiment had been doing this kind of work since 2005, long-range vehicle reconnaissance in small, fast patrols designed to provoke contact and win it. The vehicles were long-range patrol vehicles, an Australian modification of the Land Rover 110 Parenti, open-topped and unarmored, fitted with a turret-mounted heavy machine gun and nothing else between the crew and incoming fire. U.S. Marines who saw them in theater called them death cages. The SASR operators who drove them into Taliban territory called them optimally light. The distinction mattered because it explained the regiment's entire operating philosophy. Armor slows a vehicle down and turns every platform into a high-value target worth spending an RPG on. The LRPV approach was the opposite: stay fast, stay mobile, carry enough firepower to suppress anything you hit, and rely on the operators to compensate for everything the vehicle didn't provide. In the open deserts of southern Uruzgan, that equation worked. In the narrow valleys and compound-lined wadis closer to population centers, the maths shifted. The Taliban had figured this out over the preceding 6 months. 4 separate ambushes had hit SASR patrols in the Kaz-Uruzgan area since March 2008, each one bigger and better organized than the last. The Australians were being studied. The patrol that rolled out on the morning of the 2nd of September consisted of 8 SASR operators and roughly 12 ANA commandos, with interpreters riding alongside them in 6 LRPVs in a loose convoy. The route pushed along a wadi floor that offered reasonable speed but poor sightlines to the ridges on either side. Intelligence had flagged the terrain as high risk, but every route in Uruzgan was high risk by September 2008. The province was the Taliban's heartland. They defended it with the kind of resources that insurgent groups in quieter provinces couldn't match: trained fighters, heavy weapons, communications networks, and a local population that either supported them or was too afraid to resist. And the SASR had been hitting their supply lines for months, which meant the Taliban had every reason to hit back hard. The valley where the ambush was set sat roughly 25 kilometers from Fob Loch, in broken country, where low ridge lines ran parallel to the wadi floor and mud brick compounds clustered at the valley's narrowest point. The Taliban had chosen the ground carefully. An L-shaped ambush uses terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. One arm of the L runs along the patrol's direction of travel, the other cuts across it at a right angle, so the target column takes fire from the front and from one flank simultaneously. The Taliban had improved on the basic design by adding a third firing position on the opposite ridge, turning the L into a horseshoe. Mortars on the reverse slopes gave them indirect fire capability that the patrol couldn't suppress with direct fire weapons alone. The kill zone had been designed by people who'd fought coalition forces for 7 years and survived. The men who built this ambush had learned from the 4 previous contacts. They knew how SASR patrols moved: the vehicle spacing, the response drills, the suppression patterns. Each earlier ambush had been a live rehearsal, testing the Australians' reaction time and fire discipline. Taliban radio chatter intercepted before the engagement reportedly referred to the Australians as Cowboys, a term that suggested they didn't rate the small group of operators in their open trucks as a serious military force. The assessment was about to be corrected. The first rounds hit at close range. The lead LRPV, the point vehicle, took the RPG warhead almost immediately, and the blast tore through the open cabin. Simultaneously, PKM and DSHK fire opened from both ridgelines and from the compounds to the front. The combined rate of fire from the Taliban positions in the opening phase ran to several thousand rounds per minute. Dust and tracer rounds turned the valley floor into a wall of noise and flying debris. The patrol was taking fire from 3 directions within the first seconds of the engagement. The interpreter Nidash was near the lead vehicle when the RPG struck. The explosion threw him clear of the LRPV and left him lying in the open, roughly 80 meters from the nearest cover. Whether he was concussed by the blast wave or simply pinned by the sheer volume of incoming fire wasn't clear to anyone further back in the column. What was clear was that he lay in the middle of the kill zone, exposed to crossfire from at least 2 machine gun positions, and nobody could reach him without crossing 80 meters of ground that was being swept by aimed automatic weapons. The rest of the patrol did what SASR patrols are trained to do in an ambush. They fought into it. Standard doctrine for a near ambush is to assault directly through the killing zone, overwhelming the enemy with speed and aggression before they can adjust fire. For a far ambush, the drill shifts to suppression and maneuver, pin the enemy with heavy fire, and work a flanking element around to their position. Uruzgan fell between the 2 categories. Ranges varied from point blank at the head of the column to several hundred meters on the ridgelines. The patrol had to fight both fights at once. The MAG-58 machine guns on the LRPVs opened up immediately, laying suppressive fire onto the nearest PKM positions. Alongside them, the Mk-19 automatic grenade launcher, a belt-fed weapon that fires 40mm high-explosive grenades at roughly 60 rounds per minute, began working the compounds where RPG teams were shooting from. A sniper team operating from one of the rear vehicles started identifying and engaging individual Taliban fighters on the ridgelines at range. Within the first minutes, the patrol had established a loose defensive perimeter, a distribution of fire that covered the main threat axes rather than a tidy circle. The LRPVs served as firing platforms rather than cover because an open-topped Land Rover with no armor stops nothing. But the interpreter was still in the open, and Donaldson was going to get him. Trooper Mark Donaldson was 29 years old in September 2008. He'd grown up in Dorrigo, a small town on the New South Wales north coast with a population of about 1,000. His childhood had been broken early. His father, a Vietnam veteran, passed away when Donaldson was young. His mother later took her own life. Donaldson drifted through his late teens and early 20s, working as a barman in Dorrigo, surfing, going nowhere in particular, by his own account. He enlisted in the Army at 21 and eventually passed the SASR selection course, one of the most physically and psychologically demanding military assessments in the world. The regiment doesn't publish pass rates, but estimates from former operators put the figure between 10 and 15% of candidates. Donaldson made it through and deployed to Afghanistan with SOTG Rotation 9. The personal history matters because it explains his threshold for risk. Donaldson had already lived through the kind of loss that changes how a person measures what's worth doing and what isn't. His autobiography, published in 2013 under the title The Crossroad, describes his path to the regiment without self-pity. He'd arrived at the SASR because the Army gave him a structure that civilian life hadn't. By the time he was lying in the dirt at Kazaruzgan with shrapnel in his back and an unconscious man 80 meters away, the question of whether the run was worth the risk had already answered itself. On the fourth attempt, Donaldson sprinted the full 80 meters. He ran through overlapping PKM fire from 2 ridgelines across ground that had been chewed to gravel by automatic weapons for several minutes. The Taliban gunners tracked him. Rounds hit close enough to throw dirt against his legs, but he kept moving, staying low, changing direction once to throw off the gunner's lead. He reached Nidash, confirmed the interpreter was alive, grabbed him, and began dragging him back toward the nearest LRPV. The return journey was slower and worse, pulling a wounded man's dead weight across broken ground while machine gun fire followed the pair of them the entire way. He made it. Both of them made it behind the vehicle. The patrol medic began working on Nidash immediately. Donaldson himself had been hit during the opening minutes. The RPG fragment in his back was bleeding, but he didn't stop fighting after delivering the interpreter to cover. He returned to his firing position and got back on the Maggie 58. The patrol couldn't afford to lose a gun. 8 operators and a dozen ANA commandos against 80 to 150 fighters meant every weapon mattered. Donaldson stayed on the machine gun for the remainder of the engagement, and the wound went untreated until the medevac arrived hours later. While Donaldson was running his sprint, the rest of the patrol was dealing with a problem that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with inter-service bureaucracy. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller attached to the patrol had requested close air support within the first minutes of the ambush. In Afghanistan in 2008, SAS was supposed to be the great equalizer for small special operations patrols operating beyond conventional artillery range. An 8-man SASR team couldn't carry enough ammunition to sustain a 4-hour firefight against 150 fighters, but a pair of FA-18 Hornets with laser-guided munitions could end the engagement in minutes. That was the theory. The aircraft weren't Australian. They were U.S. Navy FA-18s temporarily based at Bagram Airfield, having rotated in from a carrier. Getting them overhead required coordination between the U.S. Navy chain of command and the U.S. Air Force JTAC system, with additional sign-off from Coalition Task Force headquarters. Each layer had its own approval process and its own rules of engagement verification. The SASR JTAC was requesting immediate support for troops in contact, the highest priority category in the KAS system, and the aircraft still took more than 3 hours to arrive. 3 hours in a firefight where the patrol was outnumbered by a factor of 10 to 20. The SASR debrief after the engagement identified air support response time as the single biggest vulnerability of the patrol. The operators on the ground had done everything right, established fire superiority with vehicle-mounted weapons, maneuvered within the constraints of the terrain, identified and engaged the enemy's key weapon systems. But they couldn't sustain that output indefinitely. Ammunition was finite. Barrels overheated. The Taliban kept reinforcing from compounds deeper in the valley. Without air support, the engagement was a mathematical problem with a predictable endpoint. The patrol would eventually run dry. And the aircraft that were supposed to prevent that were still on the tarmac at Bagram or circling in a holding pattern tangled in coordination protocols between two branches of the U.S. military. The Javelin changed the maths. One of the SASR operators carried a Javelin anti-tank guided missile system, a shoulder-fired weapon designed to destroy armored vehicles at ranges up to 2,500 meters. Using a Javelin against a machine gun position wasn't in any manual. The missile cost roughly $80,000 per shot and was engineered to penetrate tank armor. But the DSHK on the western ridgeline was the single most dangerous weapon in the Taliban's arsenal that day. A 12.7mm heavy machine gun with an effective range over 2,000 meters, and its rate of fire was pinning multiple vehicles in the column. The sniper team couldn't get a clean shot at the crew because of the elevation angle and the rock cover surrounding the position. The Mk-19 couldn't reach it accurately enough at that range. The operator locked the Javelin's infrared seeker onto the DSHK position at approximately 1,500 meters and fired. The missile arced upward on its top attack profile, climbing high above the target before diving onto it from above, and struck the position directly. The DSHK and its crew ceased to exist. The rock emplacement around the position was gutted. It was one of the first documented combat uses of the Javelin by Australian forces, fired at a target the weapon was never designed for. After Khazaruzgan, the SASR formally incorporated the Javelin as a surrogate artillery asset for patrols operating beyond conventional fire support range. If you didn't have mortars or guns and air support was 3 hours away, the Javelin became your heavy weapon. The doctrine update came directly from this engagement. The destruction of the DSHK broke the spine of the Taliban's fire plan. Without the heavy machine gun controlling the western ridgeline, the patrol could maneuver more freely, and the suppression from the remaining PKM positions dropped to survivable levels. The sniper team began picking off RPG teams in the compounds. The Mk-19 shifted fire to the mortar positions on the reverse slopes. The Taliban didn't collapse immediately. They were experienced fighters who'd invested heavily in this ambush, but the balance had shifted. The Australians were fighting forward instead of fighting to survive. The Taliban answered with a coordinated counterattack from 4 directions. Separate groups moved toward the patrol simultaneously, attempting to close the distance and overwhelm the defenders with numbers. This was the most dangerous phase of the 4-hour engagement. The patrol was running low on ammunition, and the wounded needed evacuation, while the air support that should have been overhead 2 hours earlier was still inbound from Bagram. The SASR operators and ANA commandos fought the counterattack with controlled bursts, shifting fire between threat axes as each group advanced. Fire discipline, the ability to stop shooting when there's nothing to hit and start again the instant there is, kept ammunition expenditure manageable. It also kept the Taliban guessing about the actual size of the defending force. 4 hours after the first RPG hit the lead vehicle, the FA-18s finally arrived overhead. By that point, the patrol had fought the engagement almost to its conclusion with vehicle-mounted weapons, small arms, and 1 Javelin missile. The aircraft engaged remaining Taliban positions on the ridgelines, and the intensity of incoming fire dropped within minutes. A medical evacuation Black Hawk came in behind the air cover, and the wounded, including Donaldson and Nidash, were flown to the surgical facility at Tarin Kowt. Nidash survived. Every Australian in the patrol survived. 7 of the 8 SASR operators had been wounded, but none fatally. Taliban casualties were estimated at over 80 fighters. The exact figure remains classified, and the area around Khazaruzgan went quiet for the next 5 months. The ambush designed to destroy the patrol had instead cost the Taliban their best fighters in the valley. The day wasn't over for the regiment. While Donaldson's patrol was fighting at Khazaruzgan, another SASR operation elsewhere in Uruzgan province went wrong. Sergeant Andrew Russell lost his life on that operation. The 2nd of September 2008 became one of the hardest days in the regiment's modern history, and Russell's passing overshadowed the Khazaruzgan engagement in the immediate aftermath. Details of Donaldson's actions didn't circulate widely outside the regiment for several weeks. The Victoria Cross investigation began almost immediately. The citation process for a VC is normally long. Witness interviews, corroborating statements, review by senior officers, legal verification, approval through the chain of command up to the Governor General. The Kaz Aruzgan investigation took 4 months. It was the shortest VC investigation in Australian history. The evidence was unambiguous. Multiple eyewitnesses and vehicle-mounted camera footage confirmed what Donaldson had done in full view of the patrol. On the 16th of January 2009, Governor General Quentin Bryce presented Trooper Mark Donaldson with the Victoria Cross for Australia. He was the 97th recipient of the VC in Australian military history, and the first Australian to receive the decoration since Warrant Officer Keith Payne earned his in Vietnam on the 24th of May, 1969. 38 years separated the two awards, a gap that spanned the end of Vietnam and the entire peacekeeping era of the 1980s and 90s before running into the first 7 years of Afghanistan. The citation described his actions as the most conspicuous acts of gallantry in circumstances of great peril. The formal language didn't capture the mechanical reality, a wounded man running 80 meters through aimed crossfire to retrieve another wounded man, failing 3 times, going back a 4th time because the alternative was leaving Nidash in the dirt. Donaldson later told interviewers that he never planned to be a hero and that he just wasn't going to leave a mate. That single sentence, paraphrased from a bloke who grew up in a town of 1,000 people and joined the Army because he didn't know what else to do, carried more factual weight than the official citation. Major General John Cantwell, who commanded Australian forces in Afghanistan, said that what Donaldson did in those 4 hours redefined what Australia asks of its soldiers. The statement was accurate in a way Cantwell may not have intended. The Kaz Aruzgan engagement exposed systemic failures in how coalition air support was structured for special operations. 8 Australians and 12 Afghan commandos had fought 150 Taliban for 4 hours with vehicle-mounted weapons and a single Javelin missile because inter-service coordination between the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force couldn't deliver aircraft in less than 3 hours. The SASR after-action report was blunt. Air support response time was the single biggest vulnerability of the patrol. The doctrinal consequences were immediate. The Javelin became a standard patrol weapon for engagements beyond artillery range, formalizing the decision one operator made under fire at Kaz Aruzgan. The 1,500-meter shot against the DSAK entered the regiment's training syllabus as a case study, proof that an $80,000 missile fired at an infantry position was rational when the alternative was waiting 3 hours for aircraft that might never come. The engagement also accelerated Australian efforts to secure dedicated air assets for SOTG operations, rather than relying on coalition-pooled resources with their layers of bureaucratic approval. The LRPVs themselves became part of the tactical record. The open-topped, unarmored Land Rovers had survived a 4-hour engagement against a force 10 to 20 times larger than the patrol. The vehicles took dozens of hits and kept functioning as weapons platforms. Small arms rounds passed through the thin bodywork without generating the secondary fragmentation that kills crews inside armored vehicles. Operators were wounded by direct hits and blast fragments, but the vehicles remained mobile throughout. The regiment's preference for speed and firepower over protection had been validated under extreme conditions, and the LRPV stayed in service for several more rotations before eventually giving way to the Supacat HMT Extenda. Nidash, the interpreter whose rescue earned Donaldson the VC, recovered fully. He later emigrated to Australia and received citizenship. Donaldson refused paid interviews and commercial sponsorship offers that followed the VC announcement. The Victoria Cross for Australia carries a stipend of roughly $4,800 per year. Donaldson served with the SASR until 2014, completing additional deployments before transitioning to civilian life as a security consultant. His post-military work took a direction that the VC citation never anticipated. Donaldson became one of the most visible advocates for veteran mental health in Australia, speaking publicly about personal trauma and the psychological cost of sustained combat operations. His mother's passing, the event that had sent him toward the Army in the first place, became part of a broader conversation about self-harm among Australian veterans that the Defence Force has struggled to address. Since 2001, 54 veterans of the SASR alone have taken their own lives. That number is larger than the regiment's combat losses across 2 decades of operations in Afghanistan. Donaldson speaks about this openly, using the attention his VC brings to force the issue into public view. The Battle of Qaz Oruzgan entered SASR doctrine as a case study in self-reliance. 8 men, 6 unarmored Land Rovers, vehicle-mounted machine guns, 1 Javelin missile, and 4 hours of ammunition carried them through an engagement that their own coalition support structure failed to resource in time. The Taliban who set the ambush expected to destroy the patrol. Their radio chatter called the Australians Cowboys. By the time the FA-18s finally arrived overhead, the Cowboys had already settled the matter on their own terms.